The life of a Roman legionary was one of extreme hardship, deprivation, and the constant threat of violent death. These professional soldiers began their service by swearing an oath, the sacramentum, pledging to endure any punishment, suffering, or torment, even execution itself, in defense of the Republic and Empire. From this moment on, a legionary's existence was defined by brutal discipline, relentless training, horrific battlefield injuries, and years of separation from family. All endured in exchange for a potential future retirement pension and parcel of land after their decades of service. In this video, we take an in-depth look at the harsh realities and brutal conditions these remarkable soldiers faced daily as they enforced Roman rule across vast territories. To produce such professional, disciplined, and physically hardened soldiers capable of withstanding the harsh campaigning conditions, the training program for Roman legionnaires was famously comprehensive and grueling from the very start. Marching and physical conditioning. Recruits were trained to march an astounding 20 Roman miles, around 18 modern miles or 29 kilometers, in just 5 hours during summer months, while carrying all their equipment and supplies weighing up to 45 pounds. This built the incredible endurance and strength required for long marches to and from battlefields fully outfitted. They also did forced marches of 18 miles and then had to immediately construct fully fortified camps upon arrival, mimicking the conditions they'd face on actual campaigns. Failure to meet the time requirements resulted in harsh disciplinary punishments. Physical training was equally intense, involving a well-rounded regimen of running, jumping, weight training with heavy packs, swimming to build all-around strength, agility, and stamina. The goal was to produce soldiers capable of marching long distances fully armed and equipped, and then still able to fight pitched battles with energy and power. Perhaps most crucial was the extensive training in Roman weapons and combat techniques. This employed a system of progressively working up to actual equipment by first using practice versions intentionally made heavier than the real weapons and armor. Recruits started by striking at wooden posts to hone their sword techniques before advancing to sparring partners, using double-weight wickerwork shields and wooden swords initially. Throwing practice javelins at targets was also drilled relentlessly after sword skills were mastered. The advanced Armatura combat training system, borrowed from gladiator schools, further sharpened their skills through realistic simulated battles and drills. Legionnaires were expected to be absolute masters of their weapons and combat techniques through this grueling process. Woven through every aspect of training was the harsh inculcation of absolute obedience to orders, military discipline, and the importance of unit cohesion on the battlefield. Punishments like reducing rations or even floggings were employed for those who failed to maintain standards. Constant drilling and formation marching hammered home the need to maintain ranks and act as a unified, cohesive fighting force, following orders without question. The tight-knit contubernium tent groups of just 8 men also fostered this critical small unit cohesion and camaraderie. Finally, legionnaires were trained in vital campaign survival skills, like rapidly building fortified camps, field sanitation, finding clean water sources, foraging for food, and treating basic battlefield injuries. Being able to quickly construct their own defensible encampments was absolutely crucial when on the march. This comprehensive training system transformed raw recruits into elite, professional heavy infantry, physically powerful and possessing incredible stamina, absolute mastery of weapons, strict discipline and obedience, strong unit cohesion, and the practical skills to survive long campaigns in the field. Legionnaires were almost constantly on grueling military campaigns away from Rome or stationed at distant frontiers, enduring years, even decades separated from their families and homes. They frequently marched upwards of 20 miles per day, fully outfitted in heavy armor and equipment across severe terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. Upon arriving at their nightly campsite, there was no rest. Legionnaires immediately had to construct their temporary fortified encampments. Using shovels, picks, and axes, they dug ditches and erected wooden palisades as defensive fortifications around the perimeter. Inside these cramped camps, the legionnaires lived in conditions of extremely poor sanitation and hygiene. Their tents were small, tightly packed shelters shared by groups of 8 men. Improvised latrines dug near the camps were critical for waste disposal to prevent the spread of disease. Bathing was also a major challenge when on long campaigns away from proper facilities. Legionnaires were forced to go weeks or even months without proper bathing, leading to poor hygiene, body lice infestations, and skin diseases. Access to clean water sources was vital, but perhaps the harshest aspect of campaigning was the strict military discipline and the constant threat of severe corporal or even capital punishment. Legionnaires could be summarily beaten or executed by their commanders for even minor offenses or infractions of rules. The punishment of decimation, where 1 in every 10 soldiers were bludgeoned to death by their comrades for offenses like insubordination or cowardice, was employed to ensure obedience even in the face of death. The psychological toll of this relentless discipline was immense. To cope, legionnaires turned to sources of psychological relief like religious rituals, festivals honoring martial gods like Mars, and any small diversions or creative outlets available like gambling, drinking games, physical competitions, singing, wood carving, or knitting during their precious downtimes. The small units formed extremely tight-knit bonds akin to family that were crucial for morale and survival amid the deprivations. This cohesion and looking out for one another allowed the legions to endure. To sustain the legions through their campaigns and combat duties, the Romans provided a simple but nourishing diet of rations designed to fuel these formidable fighting forces. The core staple was a wheat-based ration that was made into hearty bread called panis, or a thick porridge called pulse. This was supplemented by allocations of cured pork like bacon or salted meat, hard cheese made from sheep or goat's milk, and legumes like lentils or beans. Whenever available, they also received rations of vegetables like onions, cabbages, and radishes, olive oil, vinegar, and even wine on occasion, though the sour vinegar drink called posca was more common to slake their thirst. While basic, these provisions provided the calories, protein, and some vitamins required to fuel the legionnaires' intense physical exertions and demanding training regimen. They cooked these simple rations communally over campfires in their small tent groups. As for sleeping quarters, conditions were extremely cramped and rudimentary. Legionnaires did not have individual tents or beds, instead sleeping in those same small 8-man tent groups on raised plank beds with thin mattress pads stuffed with materials like straw, wool, or even leaves. Proper restful sleep was extremely difficult to achieve due to the constant noise, lack of privacy, poor bedding, and harsh environmental conditions like cold, rain, or oppressive heat that they endured while on campaign. The term tormentum vigili, or waking torture, was coined to describe the effects of pervasive insomnia and sleep deprivation legionnaires experienced, especially in the cramped, chaotic conditions of encampments. So, while their rations provided enough sustenance, the sleeping conditions were a different story. A relentless source of physical and mental strain that legionnaires were forced to endure for decades on end. Despite their training, the brutal reality is that Roman legionnaires frequently sustained horrific, life-threatening injuries on the ancient battlefields where they fought intense close-quarters engagements. Lacerations and slash wounds, the widespread use of swords, spears, javelins, and other edged weapons meant legionnaires often suffered deep lacerations and slash wounds that caused severe bleeding and risk of infection. A strike to a major artery could easily be fatal without prompt treatment. Blunt force trauma. They also commonly sustained blunt force trauma from being struck by rocks, clubs, maces, and other bludgeoning weapons. This could cause fractures, internal bleeding, and devastating head and brain injuries, leading to permanent disability or death. Puncture wounds. Puncture wounds from spear or javelin thrusts and arrow strikes were another major hazard, as they could penetrate deep into the body, damaging internal organs like lungs or causing peritonitis if the abdomen was struck. Crush injuries. Perhaps most gruesome were the crush injuries and mangling of limbs and bodies caused by being trampled underfoot during cavalry charges or being struck by heavy siege engines like ballistae and catapults. These could pulverize bones and tissue. Infection and trauma. Even a relatively minor laceration could potentially become a death sentence if the wound became infected and developed conditions like tetanus, sepsis, or gangrene before the advent of antiseptics and antibiotics. Blood loss, trauma, and shock also killed many. The heavy armor and shields legionnaires wore provided decent protection, but could never fully prevent these types of injuries in the chaos of close-quarters ancient combat against determined foes. Survival often came down to luck as much as skill. To deal with these horrific wounds, the Roman army had a remarkably advanced system of dedicated medical corps personnel and facilities for their time. Their approach blended practical battlefield triage with more long-term hospital treatment. Battlefield medicine, Roman legions were accompanied into battle by medici, teams of trained physicians, surgeons, nurses, and orderlies who were responsible for retrieving and treating wounded soldiers as quickly as possible once the fighting stopped. These medical personnel would set up temporary field hospitals called valetudinaria near the combat zones to triage and stabilize casualties. They had knowledge of using tourniquets, pressure dressings, poultices, stitching wounds closed, setting broken bones, and even rudimentary anesthesia by administering opium or other herbal sedatives. The most severely wounded would be evacuated on litters to the nearest major permanent military hospital for more intensive treatment and recovery once stabilized. Military hospitals. These permanent valetudinaria hospitals were established at every Roman legion's fortress or major encampment. They contained specialized wards and facilities for surgery, medical cases, convalescence, even physical rehabilitation for amputees and the disabled. Great emphasis was placed on sanitation and hygiene to prevent the spread of infection, something the Romans were well ahead of their time in understanding the importance of. Techniques like hand washing, changing dressings frequently, and good ventilation were all employed. Doctors and surgeons had access to a wide range of herbal remedies, poultices, ointments, and tools like scalpels, forceps, needles, and cauterizing irons. More complicated procedures like amputations, tracheotomies, and even basic surgeries were performed when necessary. Preventative care. The Roman military medical system also heavily emphasized preventative care and maintaining the health of the legions through proper camp sanitation, access to clean water sources, enforcing basic hygiene like bathing when possible, and providing healthy dietary rations. New recruits underwent stringent medical examinations to ensure they were fit for duty. Strict physical fitness regimens were also mandatory to keep the soldiers in peak condition. In addition to treating physical wounds and injuries, the medical corps also had to deal with the psychological trauma, depression, anxiety, and battle fatigue experienced by soldiers in the wake of vicious engagements. Religion, morale-building efforts, and even primitive talk therapy were employed. So while certainly not as advanced as modern medicine, the Roman military medical system was remarkably well organized, comprehensive, and forward-thinking for its time in treating the brutal wounds of warfare. The harsh realities of life as a legionary took an immense toll on their life expectancy and survival rates compared to the civilian population. Numerous studies and models have attempted to quantify just how deadly their profession was. One analysis estimated that out of every 100 recruits enlisting at age 20, only around 60 would survive to age 45 after 25 years of service, a baseline attrition rate of 40% just from the rigors of their duties over that time frame. However, the actual attrition rate was likely even higher when factoring in deaths from violence, disease outbreaks, starvation due to disrupted supply lines, and severe exposure to extreme environmental conditions. Most estimates suggest that around 40% of legionnaires died before even completing their 25-year term of enlistment. Another 15% or so would be medically discharged as invalids due to crippling illness, wounds, or injury before reaching retirement age. So, on average, a staggering 55% or more of Roman legionnaires may not have survived to collect their discharge bonus and pension after their decades of grueling military service to the empire. The greatest causes of death were not just enemy action on the battlefield, but more so from the long-term effects of infection, disease, malnutrition, and exposure that their bodies endured over years of active campaigning. That said, the rewards and incentives for completing one's service were significant. A sizable one-time discharge bonus equivalent to around 12 years of a legionnaire's salary, plus a parcel of land to settle on and work as a retired veteran. So while the odds were daunting, a sizable number of these professional soldiers, perhaps around 45–60%, did live to complete their 25-year term and receive their hard-earned retirement benefits after a lifetime of deprivation and hardship in the Roman legions. In summary, the life of a Roman legionary was one of incredible hardship, deprivation, and constant threat of violent death or dismemberment. These professional soldiers endured harsh living conditions of temporary camps, poor sanitation, and years of forced separation from family, relentless physical and weapons training to harden them for battle. Horrific battlefield injuries like lacerations, blunt trauma, punctures, and crush wounds. A remarkably advanced system of field medics and military hospitals for treatment. Extremely high attrition rates and lower life expectancy due to the rigors of their duties. Basic rations designed for nourishment, but extremely poor sleeping conditions. Yet through it all, they maintained incredible discipline, obedience, unit cohesion, and fortitude. Their coping mechanisms, from small unit bonds to religious rituals and creative outlets, allowed them to endure the unrelenting deprivations. The Roman legions were an elite force of professional infantry, forged over decades of harsh training and campaigning into a remarkably resilient and skilled fighting force that built an empire through blood, steel, and sheer tenacity. Their ability to thrive amid such brutal hardship is truly a testament to the strength of the indomitable legionary spirit that embodied the Roman virtue of virtues, a sense of excellence, courage, and perseverance in adversity.